Hello everybody, welcome. I'm Joseph Carruthers, aka TrmntdByGnomes. I'm the game master for Red Sky City Cyberpunk Conspiracy. And joining me today is Jay Gray, the media ambassador for R Talsorian Games. Thank you so much for your time, Jay, and thank you for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule in which gnomes are staking you to the ground and poking you with sticks.
You know, it's a tough job, and I'd say somebody has to do it, but really it's up to the gnomes. I don't have much of a choice in this. First things first, how exciting is it to have Red out there in the wild? Cyberpunk Red, the latest edition of the Cyberpunk RPG. Like, it's finally done. People are out there. People are going to be able to play it. It's got to be the end of a journey. I know you got other projects on your hand, but it's got to be nice.
It is. It's a funny thing because you work on a project and you work on a project and you work on a project, and there's stress to get it done, to get the writing, the layout, to get everything right, to get everything perfect, to get it to the press. Will it go get it the first time, or the press? Will the printer say, "Oh no, you got to fix this, this, and this," and then it's the stress of waiting. Now there's literally nothing we can do but wait for the printer to be done, and then it's out, and it's the stress of, well, what if I miss something? What if we on page 323 there is a upside down picture that we didn't realize was upside down at the time? What if people hate it? But at the same time, there's a jubilation of getting it out the door, and the constant worry that all artists have that their art is horrible, and it is not. It is a fantastic book, and we're really proud of it. I'm really proud of it. But so it is equal parts joy and terror.
Yeah, that about covers it. And the process can be so opaque, and it can be opaque to people on the outside who are eagerly awaiting the game, and it can be opaque to people on the inside when it enters black box areas like the printing process or other areas where it's completely out of your hands. And we've both worked for companies under NDA a lot, and we know that oftentimes we wish we could just tell everybody, look, here's what's going on, but we can't, and it's frustrating to have that disconnect. So once everything's out there on the table, like, it's a huge relief.
Yeah, it is. It is super helpful. And there's things I can go through. I can go through the 3-hour spiel as to why, exactly why because for example, I can tell you about how printing. It's not the printing that takes a long time. It's the binding, because no matter how fast the printer is, it still takes a certain amount of time for glue to dry.
Right.
So, and it's like the bits and mortar thing, which we're doing bits and mortar, where you can go and if you buy it at a physical location, that's part of the program. You get the PDF for free. When we first announced it, we announced that we were going to release the PDF and the hardcover around the same time, because we wanted to encourage people to go to their local stores and buy, because it's been a horrible year for local gaming stores. Everyone's like, well, why don't you just do bits and mortar and encourage them? And I said, I want to tell you that we're really looking into that, and we're trying to work with it, but until we know for sure, I can't really talk about it.
Right.
So yeah, but fortunately we can. But yeah, no, this is a great book, and I am glad to be able to actually talk about what's inside of
it. Yeah, now that the NDA, the embargo is over. So let's sort of get into the meat of it. When I started running Red Sky City Cyberpunk Conspiracy, we had access to the Jumpstart kit, we had access to some of the 2020 material, and I was patching the two together in order to create the sort of things that we wanted to do. And it was very clear that Cyberpunk 2020 was very much a game of its time. It comes from this era when, if you didn't have at least 5 different tables you had to roll on to resolve an action, you weren't considered a real RPG. And there were a lot of things in that system that I really, really liked. The granularity of the damage system, of the cover system, so on and so forth. And looking at the completed Cyberpunk Red book, it's very much a modern game. It's really taken into account the fact that this modern trend of game design is to say, hey, honestly, a lot of the stuff we used to do, computers are really good at now. Let's focus on the things that RPGs, tabletop RPGs, are really good at, and that nothing else can really do. So I like the improvements and the streamlining that was done in Cyberpunk Red. I feel like it maintains the identity and the grittiness, the lethality of the system without, too much stuff bogging it down. Is there anything you can tell us about what guided the game design process and helped make those decisions about what aspects do we leave in that are integral to what sets Cyberpunk apart from your other, fantasy role playing games, etc., and what you decided to let go?
Yeah, and you covered actually really. It's one of those things where the question answers the question. Um, of course, no matter how much playtesting you do, and this is true of Dungeons and Dragons, this is true of Pathfinder, this is true of Call of Cthulhu, it's true of Cyberpunk. No matter how much playtesting you do before you release your game, there is no playtesting like having thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people out in the world playing your game constantly for
Mm-hmm.
30 years. And so
Yeah.
we learned a lot just from just the game's been out. The first edition came out in '88, the second edition came out in '90, and we learned and we learned and we learned and we learned and we paid attention to what people did and what house rules they're talking about, because Interlock, the system that this runs on, is a very customizable, very easily hackable system. So
Mm-hmm.
we learned from that. What were people dropping? What were people changing? How often did they do this? How often did that? And for example, net running. Did anyone use the net running rules? The answer was usually no. So we said, oh, obviously net running needs to change. How often do people use because in Cyberpunk 2020, it's roll to hit, roll to see where you hit, then roll damage. And
Mm-hmm.
it's at least 3 steps, and it's actually more steps if you're doing auto fire or something like that. So that was a case of how many people drop the roll to hit unless you're aiming, and we learned about that. And there was a case of you're right, back in 2020, back when 2020 came out, we were getting into the era. It was kind of on this border where the trend was some games got very simulationist, and then at the same time, you started having storyteller games, White Wolf games, for example, World of
Mm-hmm.
Darkness, where games started getting very lighter. And R Tal has worked with both games. Mike Pondsmith designed both games. 2020 was fairly simulationist.
Mm-hmm.
And like, for example, all the damage was worked out based on very real FBI forensics data involving gunshot damage.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have Castle Falkenstein, our steampunkish game, which is very rules light, and it's much simpler. As you got further and further into the modern era, the simulations and stuff, I like to say that there are games where the mechanics are above the hood,
Mm-hmm.
and there are games where the mechanics are below the hood. And a game like every game has mechanics. Every game has a lot of math, whether you know it or not. And your storytelling games, the math is all pumped under the hood, so you never see it. It's like an automatic transmission. And your simulation games are like a manual transmission. And we went kind of halfway between an automatic and a manual there, because we said it still needs to feel like Cyberpunk. It still needs to feel like the interlock system, but there's a lot of things to speed it up at the table. Actually, in a lot of ways, watching people play it virtually in actual plays helped too, because we saw, okay, we can see where this really slows things down.
Mm-hmm.
Because this round should be over now, and it's not. It feels like at this point I'm just spouting numbers and I'm not telling a story. So that was a big thing. Is we looked at that, and it was that balance between, does it feel cyberpunk, and in that case we did things like remove the hit locations, but keep in an aiming system and tying that
Mm-hmm.
aiming system to the critical injury system we put into place. So there's still that bad things happen, and I'm not just chipping away at someone until their hit points are 0. But at the same time, it just runs faster because I no longer have to say, well, roll 1, roll 2, roll 3, roll 4, roll 5 until I'm done.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also like a big change that we haven't talked about much is we moved from essentially in 2020, in theory, you can take as many actions as you want in your turn, because there's no specific rule saying I can take only 2 actions or 3 actions based on my dexterity reflexes. That got house ruled a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So we moved it to just you get one, unless you're net running. But that one action, if you got a rate of fire 2 weapon, or you have 2 rate of fire 2 weapons, you can take 2 attacks. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
because and it's no longer I take an action, then I take a second action at -3, then I take a third action at -6, then I take a fourth action until I can't possibly go, and that speeds things up too. So it was a lot of just how is it being played out there in the wild, and then where does the math go, and how much of the math can we just duck below the hood or shunt to somewhat optional choice-based systems. When you get into game design, for example, James Hutt, one of the people who we call the mayor of Balancetown, he did a lot of
Mm-hmm.
the mechanical work on this game. He's got an economics degree. So when we talk about these things, there's a lot of probability curves and maths involved.
I feel like that stuff is it's one of the aspects of game design that is the most opaque to outsiders. There's
Mm-hmm.
this cliche that everybody in games, whether it's computer games, tabletop games, etc., everyone has an idea for the game they want to make, like what they think would be the coolest game, and they come up with ideas for mechanics and story and all that stuff. But the actual underlying framework, the math, the economy, the curves, and all that stuff, that's the thing where if you start out not knowing what you're doing, you're going to go completely off the rails and botch the whole thing up.
Yeah, you have to understand because it comes down to how you resolve a task.
Mm-hmm.
What mechanical thing resolves a task does a player do, and then what do they compare against to determine whether they succeed or fail? And if those two
Mm-hmm.
don't balance, if they don't match, whole game is just either too easy or too hard, or this very random. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's hard, kind of situation where it makes no sense. And there are different approaches. A D20 system tends to be very random centric in that the
Swingy.
die really matters. Yeah, it swings
Mm-hmm.
a lot because the die really matters. Because we use a D10 system, the skill plus stat really matters. There's a lot less swing, though we do have the strange critical explosions on either end.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all just a matter of things. But in either case, you've got to look at your difficulties, your target numbers, whatever you want to call them, and say, well, do these target numbers mathematically match so that they are in the sweet range we want them to be, so that someone of X plus Y will succeed a certain percentage of the time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, for a difficult task, maybe you want them to succeed 50% of the time if they are of average ability, which means you
Mm-hmm.
got to make sure that in our case, the stat plus the skill plus an average of 4 to 6 on the die roll will equal or beat the difficulty value. So yeah, it's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of math, and unfortunately, that requires even storytelling-based game designers. They really not to have to stop and think about that math and do the curves. Luckily, there's a lot of software that will do that for you these days.
Mm-hmm. And you've got the mayor of Balancetown with an economics degree finding an ideal niche in game design. It lends itself quite nicely. It's like that thing where Eve Online has hired these gigantic mega mind economists because the whole game is mostly spreadsheets and you need to have that to keep the thing working. One thing
Yeah.
that's really interesting to me. Go ahead. That's the delay kicking in. Go
So as
ahead.
I say, James did a really good job. The math between James and Mike, because Mike's been doing this for
Hmm.
forever. He's been doing this for a long time, and he's got he's got a good sense of it just from experience. And then James has his economics degree and some good experience. Between the two of them, this is the tightest math of any game we've ever put out. So please go ahead.
I always I always read the updates from Balancetown that says, yeah, we ran a Monte Carlo on this 10 million times and it roughly adds up. So if you die, it's because you made a dumb choice. Uh, Real quick, before the next thing I want to talk about is sort of how the world of cyberpunk has evolved. And there's more game design stuff that
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch upon because, I'm a huge nerd and I love this stuff. But when it comes to the world of cyberpunk, what's interesting to me is that the genre is often rooted in the original vision of the 80s, right? When in the
Mm-hmm.
heyday of cyberpunk media, when the genre was born, and a lot of fiction stays in that world. And one of the interesting things to me about the cyberpunk RPG is how it's still rooted in that retro future of the what the 80s thought the cyberpunk world would look like. If you look at the
Hmm.
2020 rulebook, it was contemporary, it was looking into the future, and it had fax machines and cassettes and all that stuff. And the really interesting thing to me about this world is that there haven't been a lot of retcons. Like there's been retcons when you have to deal with things like, what do we do about the carbon plague, and about the various spin-offs that have happened that need to be woven back into the timeline. But when it comes to the integrity of the universe and its technological feel, things like agents, for example, you knew when you were designing the game there had to be smartphones. Like a vision of the future that didn't include some approximation of smartphones just would not grok with a modern audience. But it feels like these
Yes.
ideas have been brought in accordance with that original timeline rather than retconning things to accommodate for the way that our future has turned out. Um, is there a methodology for figuring out the best way to do that, to update the future without erasing your version of the future?
Well, it's a couple of things. One thing is we were very fortunate that the big thing was there was no this was not a reboot. It was never intended to be a reboot. 2077 is not a
Right.
reboot. It's a branching timeline. The same way that you play Fallout, you don't expect the next Fallout to say, "Oh well, people are now
Mm-hmm.
using microchips instead of vacuum tubes in their stuff you know, because that's just the Fallout universe. That's the timeline. So there was that. But we had the best of both worlds where we were able to do that kind of cool retro futuristic thing when we wanted to. But at the same time, we had a good time jump and we were able to say, oh, well, smartphones. Yeah. People, agents, 3D printing and microfabrication. That makes sense to be there. And in fact, there is an entire there's a screen sheet in the book now that revolves around 3D fabrication. So there is some methodology to it. There's some differences. We have to keep it in mind. Every time we introduce a new piece of technology, we have to ask ourselves, is this fit the genre? Does it fit the universe? Where does it come from? Can we see a line? Can we draw a line and say, oh, this makes sense that this evolved this way? Agents evolving that way makes sense because as the net broke down, you got fewer and fewer people. One of the reasons why touchscreens didn't take off in the Cyberpunk universe. Smartphones are all about microprocessors and touchscreens. Exactly. When you can plug it into your head, why do you need to have a little phone? You can just kind of see it, and when you control it with your
Mm-hmm.
head. At the same time, the internet is different too because of the exact same thing. When you do that, why do you need an HTML web-based interface when you can just go through? So it evolved differently. Now, because the net broke down, that actually solves a lot of those problems for us. You suddenly need touchscreen displays more, and the web's going to look more like regular web pages because more people are going to be
Mm-hmm.
using those touchscreens, and that's just one of the most optimal ways to present information and user interface on a screen as opposed to stuck in your head.
For folks who may not be familiar with some of the backstory that we're talking about here, in the cyberpunk universe, the net was essentially a virtual reality. It replaced the internet that we have in, our current dark future.
Mm-hmm.
It replaced it with this virtual reality world. It was super, super evocative. It was all highly visual. People had custom, VR environments and data fortresses. It was this entire parallel world that existed alongside the physical world. And the net running you may have seen in Red Sky City, etc., it's moved into this augmented reality instead of virtual reality, which I think is brilliant. And I hadn't actually thought about the fact that it lets you bring technology in line with more of our world. I was mostly
Yeah.
focused on the gameplay design choices, which makes total sense. One, simplifying net running from being basically its own game system, it
Mm-hmm.
solves the problem of being onerous on the game master. Well, I have to create this, huge amount of content for this one player who's a net runner in the party. It also solves the problem of the person being back at base while the rest of the party goes on the adventure. I think that the constraint of having to be on site and having the virtual world projected over the physical world does a great job of keeping the party together. So, all that made a ton of sense, but just the fact that you get rid of one of the most out there concepts and ground it closer to our reality while still keeping that cyberpunk je ne sais quoi, that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
One of
Yeah.
the other
It took
thing,
a while.
Hmm.
It took a little while, but it was one of those things that really it worked mechanically. It worked uh, literarily. It worked in the narrative and it worked in the mechanics, and it
Hmm.
was a beautiful thing. Um, quite honestly, even if I were to go back and play 2020, I'd still run it this way and just say, well, no one in the right mind, no company in the right mind is going to have their super sensitive data on a system that's not air gapped. So you've got to be in there. And
Hmm.
the big difference would be I maybe say you have to switch back and forth between meat space and net space rather than having them overlaid.
Hmm. So this moves us into some more of the plot and world changes of the time of the
Mm-hmm.
Red. So I like the fact that you've got a couple different settings. Obviously, in the rule book, there's still a lot about Night City because Night City is, in a lot of ways, the pulsing heart of the cyberpunk world. And there's plenty of other stuff that you can do in cyberpunk. Like there's all
Mm-hmm.
sorts of stuff going on everywhere else. But now it's sort of divided into two core settings, I would say. You've got Night City or your city, if you want to cyberpunk up wherever it is that you happen to live. And then you've got this road warrior style, open dust bowl wastelands, not a radioactive wasteland. And the fiction in the new book, you've got some of the old fiction that we had before. You've got Fall of the Towers, which I haven't read enough of the 2020 era stuff to know if that story was already out there, right? And then you've got the new piece of
Yeah.
fiction, which I'm not going to talk about because I don't want to spoil anything. And that really
Yes.
moves us more into this new setting that has been introduced that feels like it's designed to go hand in hand with the Night City style neon lights. Especially, it gives the Nomad a chance to shine. What are you able to tell us right now? And obviously, some of this is going to have to be under lock and key about what's next for Cyberpunk Red in terms of splat books, settings, gear books, etc. What sort of stuff can you hint at that's cooking behind the scenes that might take us into this world?
Okay. Well, I mean, we've announced Black Chrome. Anybody who
Mm-hmm.
has been playing 2020 will know that the Chromebooks are some of our most popular and famous supplements, and they were essentially the Sears catalog, but for Cyberpunk. If you're old enough to
Mm-hmm.
remember what the Sears catalog was, Amazon, but for Cyberpunk, only in a catalog form. They were gearbooks, but they were gearbooks written in world, so they also gave you a real good glimpse of what the world was like through how things were sold to you. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Black Chrome will be a little different because the way you buy and sell things in Cyberpunk Red is different. It will be a little rougher. I can't say too much about how it's going to be presented, but it's going to be not just a book about what you can get, but ways you get things. A little bit. It's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
We actually have a pretty good section on the economy and how you buy things in the core rulebook, but we're going to go more into it in Black Chrome. Beyond that, we are going to do a 2077 supplement for Red
Cool,
somewhere
cool.
down the line. And beyond that, there's lots of ideas. Um, we could do anything. We could update the Night City sourcebook. We could do a new book for high riders, which are the guys in space. Uh, there is the nomads. Everybody deserves their own book. It's just a question of where we decide to prioritize and what
Mm-hmm.
stories we decide to tell with it. And so
Because you
that
guys
I
are
can't get
juggling.
too far into. Yeah, we are. I mean, we're a small company. There's only so much you can
Mm-hmm.
do in a year, and we're books are a little more in depth these days than they used to be. You used to be able to put out like a nice
Yes.
thin little paperback book, and now you've got to have more data in there. And so, but we're also also have to take care of our other lines. We've got Witcher stuff coming out primarily in addition to the Cyberpunk stuff, and we can't just drop everything to work on Cyberpunk and not leave Witcher alone because unfortunately, the truth is that for a game line to stay alive, you've got to continually put out new content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very much the way that things go these days. I'm
Yep.
excited about the idea of a 2077 plugin book. What can you tell us about the push and pull between R Talsorian Games and CD Projekt in terms of storyline? Like because I understand that it sounds like you guys had a lot of opportunity to shape things, but you had to meet them
Mm-hmm.
halfway somewhere with whatever their ideas or their basic needs for creating a AAA title are. What can you tell us about that dynamic?
It is collaborative. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Mike and CDPR hammered out a timeline, a what happens between in this case, the end of the Fourth Corporate War, and 2077. So
Mm-hmm.
we have a very good, strong, rough idea, very broad, big picture idea of what happens after 2045, which is when Red is set, up until 2077. And they've talked a little bit about it in the World of Cyberpunk book from Dark Horse.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, for example, that at some time between 2045 and 2077, there are the Unification Wars. And that is when the United States decides that the president of the United States decides that there needs to be a cohesive and whole union, and decides to try to bring the free states back into line. And there are various conflicts based on that. However, we don't know all the specifics yet. It's a case of you paint in the broad strokes, or you do the broad strokes,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll be able to go back in later and paint in the things, the details. So there's some good there, and there's a lot of back and forth. Like, for example, Johnny Silverhand shows up in 2077. He's a character that's literally existed from the very first Cyberpunk book back in 1988.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, we want to do this with Johnny, and we were like, okay. And so Mike said, let me figure out how that happened in the past. We already knew that Johnny went up in the tower at the end of the Fourth Corporate War. We knew that he was there when the nuke went off, or at least he was in the area when the nuke went off. We know that Atom Smasher shot him many, many times. So we knew all that. And it
Cut
was
him
a
in
question
half, if I recall correctly.
That's what it suggests in the book, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, that is what Fall of the Towers is. That story comes from that.
Mm-hmm.
Those supplements. This pieces of fiction spread throughout that book that are strung together into a full storyline. But beyond that, there's a question of, I don't think it's a spoiler at this point to say that Johnny is a digital ghost in 2077, and how did that happen? And so that's something Mike and CDPR worked on together. They said, we need him to be this, and Mike said, okay, let me figure out, and we'll talk about ideas how he can get that way. And it works in reverse. We'll say, okay, we want this to happen in Red, and this is something that you probably want to carry forward into 2077. And sometimes it'll be little things like certain things about how Trauma Team operates. Where Mike said Trauma Team is like this, and they said, okay, well, how about if it grows into this, and so forth. So it's very much a collaborative process. Mike has what he calls his opposite number over at CDPR. His name is Patrick. Patrick is, primary point of contact for him in terms of, well, we want to do this, and Mike will say, okay, cool, and they'll work out the details. I've gotten to sit in a room with the two of them together, and it's like watching Lucas and Spielberg working out, how the storyline's going to go, and it's fantastic. There's some really good synergy there, and there are going to be conflicts too. They're going to say, we want to do this, and we'll say, well, we don't really like that, and you're in our sandbox at that point because we don't think that should happen at the time of the Red. Or we'll say, well, we'd really like to do this, and they say, well, by 2077, that thing has to change because we aren't doing. We've specifically said in the game this has happened. So, but we work it out. We are fortunate. We've had a very good relationship. I'm not going to name names because that's rude, but I have heard of other tabletop companies whose products have been made into video games who have not had so good an experience in terms of the back and forth between the two, and often end up with world changes. And that's something Mike really made sure before he signed on for this, that not only would the world be respected, but the collaboration would. He didn't want this is our cyberpunk, and it's not your cyberpunk, or this is cyberpunk, this is something else just with your brand name on it. He wanted, this is a cyberpunk we're creating together.
Awesome. One thing I can think of that I can assume was important to the folks over at CD Projekt Red was, it's really hard to do something in the Cyberpunk universe without Arasaka. Like, they're absolutely essential to the world. Militech also, but I'd argue that like Arasaka probably is more core to the identity of the central narrative of Cyberpunk. And obviously, by 2077, you need Arasaka operating in Night City. You need them back in the States. And one of the core pieces of fallout from the Fourth Corporate War was that they were banned. So I imagine, I could easily imagine that one of their asks was, hey, we need Arasaka back in. We can't do this game without Arasaka. Can you figure out how to get them back and operating in the continental US? And if what I've read is correctly, they play an important part in the unification wars, and that gets them some good
Yes.
clout with the right people. And there you've got their name on the building in the trailer again.
Yeah, with Arasaka, it was a case that was there was a lot of time spent back and forth. It's like, what happened to Arasaka? How, where does Arasaka come in again? How do they build up power? Because because the thing is they were not only kicked out of the United States, they suffered a humiliating loss of face in Japan as well.
Mm-hmm.
And because the Japanese government said enough is enough, because what happened was the United States basically called Japan and said, if you don't stop this, I'm gonna consider it an act of war, and then you're gonna have to deal with that. And it's not gonna be
Mm-hmm.
Arasaka and Militech fighting; it's gonna be us and you. And so Arasaka suffered from there, but we know how Arasaka rebuilt itself in Japan, how it came back to the continental United States. That's information we know that they worked on together, and even little things like how Arasaka's heirs split into factions. That was
Mm-hmm.
something they worked out, and that's something we talk about in Red. It's something that shows up in 2077. The children and grandchildren of Saburo, and even though Saburo's still alive, and by the way, that was talked about too. Um, uh, all this information goes back and forth, and yeah, absolutely, your big ask. They're big ask on their part, but it wasn't that big. But you're right, Arasaka belongs in the cyberpunk narrative, and so it was not a question of
Mm-hmm.
can we so much as a question of how we.
Right. In the last episode of our show, I dropped some soul killed bodies with green pheasant tags on it. So for anybody who's watching who is up to date on their Arasaka lore, keep an eye out for that. That was for you guys. Are there any specific plans that you're allowed to talk about with regards to virtual tabletop support? Because the situation with the ongoing pandemic crisis, and obviously virtual tabletop is here to stay as a mainstay of the gameplay environment, but especially right now. Are there any announced things that you can talk about playing Cyberpunk Red virtually?
Not yet. It's something we're exploring hard. It's a question of the best way for us
Mm-hmm.
to do it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so I want to say stay tuned. There's going to be virtual support of some kind. I just can't say how and where quite yet. Uh, and we're looking at how far we want to go, how we want to do it, sort of thing. And it's a slower, deliberative process than perhaps it could be, but I think it'll be a better one in the end because of it.
Kind of has to be, given how many different virtual tabletop vendors are out there, the benefits and setbacks of each of them.
That's the other thing. 2-3 years ago, when people started asking for virtual tabletop support, they said, "Can you do it on Fantasy Grounds and can you do it on Roll20?" And now it's Fantasy Ground and Roll20 and Virtual Tabletop Simulator and Roll and Astral, and there's a lot of choices there. One thing
Mm-hmm.
I will say is that the fan community has been very good about stepping up and creating character sheets, which has been useful. And I honestly fully expect Red character sheets to be up within a week on a lot of them,
Mm-hmm.
just because there are people, they'll just take their jumpstart ones they've already done, they'll modify them, and they'll be something you can work with. But official, you get it from us support, it's coming down the line. I just can't say when, where, or how yet.
I used to work for Blizzard, and that's what we would call soon TM. So
Yeah.
it's in the
Yeah.
works, but we can't talk about basically anything yet.
Yeah. And it's one of those things where it's not just us, because it's also them. And so whenever
Mm-hmm.
it's a collaborative process of any kind, you have to have everyone sign off before you can talk about it.
Absolutely. We're starting to wind down here, but I do want to at least mention and then ask sort of an open-ended question: the Bits and Mortar endeavor. I remember
Hmm.
when it was announced, during leading up to the release of Cyberpunk Red, and the constant when's it coming out? When's it coming out? It's been in the works for ages. When's it coming out? Blah blah blah. And the choice to not release a PDF ahead of time in order to bolster your friendly local gaming store is something that I personally respect. I think it's really important. They play an integral role in the community, in sort of the legacy and culture, if you will, of tabletop games. Uh, what went into making bits and mortar happen? How complex was that process? And did you get a lot of negative feedback about that choice to when the PDF was ostensibly ready, or when people thought it was ready to hold off on it?
There were some calls to release it as soon as people heard that we were starting to give it to actual players, not realizing that what we were giving them
Mm-hmm.
was a like 300-page Word document that was not well formatted for people reading. So this is a very complex question. The first one is a PDF a value added bonus, or is a PDF a separate project? If I go into a bookstore and I buy a
Mm-hmm.
copy of a game manual, I don't expect them to give me a second game manual for free, a physical one. And that makes a intuitive sense because each one costs something to make in terms of literally the paper costs something, the printing costs something.
Mm-hmm.
The PDF doesn't cost anything specifically to make in terms of physical matter. I don't have to print it. I don't need to bind it. I don't need to store it. I don't need to ship it. Well, I mean, I have to store it online, but that's a different kind of thing. But it does cost something to make. It's not just a case of, yes, technically speaking, I can take the PDF I send to the printer, PDF it again, and I've got a PDF for giving out digitally. But at the same time, there was money that went into that whole process. We paid the writers, we paid the artists, we paid the editors, we paid uh, the layout, we paid everybody this thing, and the margins on role-playing games is very thin. And so we were quite honestly reluctant to say, okay, here's the PDF at no cost, because um, every little penny counts for keeping our lights on
Mm-hmm.
and paying everybody a fair wage. And I will tell you this, the truth is your role-playing books are underpriced based on the cost that goes into them. Um, that being said, at the same time, COVID happened. And suddenly we had all these stores which have not been doing well to begin with, and have been really experimenting with, because there's been a growth in role-playing games in general, sales-wise. And so stores were, once
Mm-hmm.
upon a time, you go into a store and you'd be lucky if they had a couple of D&D manuals. And now they're trying to grow it off and having larger shelves and more products. And we want to encourage that. And we know that that's hard because the sexy product is the board game or or the miniature war game. And
Mm-hmm.
role-playing games aren't quite the sales juggernauts they were. But at the same time, selling something at a store requires people to go there. COVID came. And so we looked around, we said, how do we help stores? And the first thing was, okay, let's not release the PDF early, or if we do, not too early, because we want people to be encouraged to go to the store. Um, and then the Twitch game came up. We decided, okay, we're going to release the PDF on the game day that Mike runs the Twitch game, which, by the way, will be at GlitchCon today, possibly happening. I don't know when this is going live on your channel, but it's possibly either happening now over at Twitch Gaming, or it has happened and hopefully will be a video on demand. But Mike will be running Cyberpunk Red for a number of influencers and celebrity actual players. Very exciting. And we decided, well, that's too big a deal not to release. So we decided to do the digital on that day, and then the physical a few days later. At the same time, we're thinking, well, another way we can help. And people said, if you want to help stores, let them get the digital as part of pre-order. And we said, oh, that's a good idea. And we looked into Bits and Mortar, which is run by a company called Evil Hat, or by Fred Hicks, the president of Evil Hat Games. They are primarily known for their fate-based games. One of the biggest is the Dresden Files role-playing game, which is based on the book series by Jim Butcher. Um, and it's a simple process. Actually, it was really easy to sign up for and really easy for stores to sign up for. And the idea is the store has access to the PDF, and they can give you the code. They can literally give it to you on a USB drive. They can email it to you, however it works for them, whatever process works best for them. And that way, we're encouraging people to go to the stores. We are selling it ourselves on our web store. We are not giving away the PDF on our web store to people, because we really want people to go to that local gaming store. Give them your money. They really need it. They honestly do.
I didn't realize that it sort of allows the stores to handle things on their own, because I could imagine that being a huge logistical, technological problem. But just by saying, hey, you get to do this as a value add, that makes a lot more sense. I was going to
That yeah,
sign
that
off here
that was the other
by
thing is we had to look sorry. We had to look at how much time it would take us to run the information, how much time it would to do the process. And the way we're doing it, fortunately, it doesn't take us too much time at all. And if this works out, we'll look at it in the future for other products. Right now, it's just for the core rulebook and just for the Jumpstart kit.
awesome. Well, I was going to wrap up by telling people where they could find Cyberpunk Red and when they could get it, but we actually just took care of that. Look into your friendly local gaming store to pick it up and get a copy of the PDF as well. You can watch Cyberpunk Red on twitch.tv/DNPeak on Wednesday nights at 5 o'clock. That's our show, Red Sky City. Do you know if there's going to be a Twitch category for it?
I need to talk to them about that. There is actually a 2020, I believe. We need to suggest it. I think that's one of the things where if enough people ask for it, they'll give it to us. We don't have much sway with Twitch itself. And speaking of Do Not Peek, which Red Sky Cities is an excellent game. I have watched many episodes of it and I highly recommend it. I want to actually call out something that you do specifically, Mr. Tormented by Gnomes. And what it is 3 or 4 episodes in, your spoilers for people who haven't watched it yet. There's a thing that happens where they are forced to go on site into a corporate enclave to get information. And you make such excellent use of skills people would think would be useless. A lot of times people look at us and say, oh my God, why are they including those skills like business and bureaucracy? But you make such good use of those skills. You make such excellent narrative use of those skills. I was really impressed by that. So I wanted to call that out.
Thank you. I mean, it's part of the entire cyberpunk genre that corporations rule everything. So if you create a character who lives in that framework, that should come with a form of power. And I really wanted to reward that because the character in question, Natalie Smith, played by Seltzer, didn't come equipped for combat, didn't come, geared out with cyberware and all that stuff, but she still has a form of power that's very real in that world. So I think it's important for all GMs and all systems to make sure that whatever their characters create is able to engage on their terms with the world. So when you're creating your Cyberpunk Red character out there, do not be afraid to pick up the weird little niche skills, because this is a world of both cyborgs blowing you away with chain guns and boardroom meetings and all that stuff. It's all in there.
That is true. And if you need an example of how to do it, watch this game, watch Red Sky City, because it does a really good job of moving back and forth, pants incident aside, between I'm good at combat and I'm good at net running and I'm good at talking corp speak, and giving each character a shining moment. There's a if I may tangent for a second, some people are used to the concept of balance. There's a concept of balance in gaming where are all the characters balanced, and a lot of times they work on it on a very fantasy dungeon crawling level where every character has something to do in a fight. And if I take X characters of X level and put them against X monster with X combat rating, I will have a decent, this will be an easy fight, a hard fight, a medium fight. And Cyberpunk looks at balance differently, and it says, does every character have an interesting role to play in the world? And that does require GM buy-in, because it requires the GM to say, okay, I've got a character who has these skills, and what do I do with them? And so it's a little different, it might be a little harder, it's a little less formulaic, but if it's done well, it's really rewarding.
It is, and I think the players really appreciate that, especially given the high lethality, which is one thing that carried over nicely from 2020 into Cyberpunk Red, is this idea that,
Oro.
Yeah, you can run it. I know, right? Pour one out for Oro. You can do the thing where you run in stylistically John wooing all these nerds in the street, but it's also, the reality of it is, anytime you meet one person with a gun, your life is on the line. It doesn't matter if that is a mook, is still on the line.
Yeah.
Which learned in the first couple episodes when we killed someone immediately.
Yeah, in Cyberpunk, the question should never be, how do I do this fight? It should always be first, should I be in this fight?
One thing we haven't had the opportunity to use, although by the time this comes out, I hope to have done so, is the face down rules. I plan to use that again, a little time travel here, but hopefully that'll come out in a very, very recent episode of Red Sky City, just to get this idea that reputation is power. And if you can end a fight just by giving them the smolder if you pull it off properly, and
Yep.
if you are a bad enough dude and people have heard of you.
Well, that comes down to Mike being a fan of samurai movies, and there's the old samurai movie trope where two samurais meet on either end of a bridge, and they stare at each other, each with their hand on their blade, and then suddenly one will just take their hand off their weapon and step aside. And so that's what a face down is. A face down is just game recognizes game, and game recognizes that your game is better than their game.
Awesome.
And it's
Jay,
a great system, and I recommend using it.
It's going to happen.
Yeah, sorry.
Again, a couple hours from recording, a few days before release. Jay, thank you again for your time, and thank you for your support of the show. We were really surprised and happy to get a copy of the rule set that's allowed us to play. We've been really loving the full rule book. I can't tell you how excited I was to dig into the night market section and all that. I think you have a winner on your hands, and we'll continue to have adventures in this world, and we wish you and the whole team at R Talsorian Games lots and lots of success with the launch.
Thank you. You guys, have a great, you're on your second season, right? Have a fantastic second season. I hope for a third.
Fingers crossed. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. Go play some Cyberpunk, and take care.